They came in waves, crossing seas and mountains under banners, marked with a crimson cross, their eyes fixed on a promise whispered by priests and kings alike: salvation, eternal life, bought with the blood of infidels. In November of 1095, in the cold air of Clermont, Pope Urban II raised his voice above the restless crowd, calling upon the faithful to march east and reclaim the Holy Land from the hands of Muslims who, he said, defiled it with their unbelief. He promised them not riches, not land, but something far greater: an absolution of sins, the cleansing of their souls through holy war. And they answered: lords who sought land and glory, peasants who sought escape from famine and hardship, thieves hoping to trade punishment for piety, and men who saw in the promise of war a cleansing fire that would lift them from the mud into the arms of God. They gathered in ragged camps outside towns, in forests, in city squares, clutching rusty swords, axes, and the few belongings they could carry. They believed they were chosen, that every step they took eastward would echo in heaven. But faith is a blade that cuts deeper than steel. What began as the march of holy warriors quickly became a tide of hunger, madness, and brutality that swallowed villages and cities, friend and foe alike. Their faith turned iron in their blood, and in the eyes of these crusaders, every crime could be forgiven, every slaughter could be sanctified, if it was done beneath the sign of the cross. They burned synagogues with people inside. They slaughtered entire communities that did not share their faith, and when the promise of heaven demanded more, they would feed on the flesh of the fallen, tearing meat from bone in the name of survival, and perhaps, in the darkest corners of their souls, in the name of the God they believed was watching them. The Crusades were not a single war, but a series of fires set across the world, burning through the lands they touched, leaving behind stories of unimaginable cruelty hidden beneath the chants of prayers and the glow of candlelight. And as they pressed toward Jerusalem, the holy city that stood like a beacon in their minds, they carried with them not only the cross but the taste for blood that would soon flood the streets of the Holy Land. They were holy warriors, they said. But the truth, hidden in the screams of the dying and the ashes of the conquered, was that they became something else entirely. And this is their story. They left Europe in a tide of faith and hunger, a sea of ragged banners flapping beneath grey skies, men and women trudging forward on blistered feet, believing that every mile they crossed would wash their sins away. They crossed the cold rivers of Europe, through Hungary, through the Balkans, into the lands of Byzantium. There, in the walls of Constantinople, they glimpsed the wealth they did not have. Glittering mosaics, high domes, spices and silks flowing through markets, and some among them already felt their faith twisting into envy. They moved across Anatolia, where the land was dry and hard, where the roads were narrow, and where the Seljuk Turks harassed them, like wolves in the dark. Arrows rained down on them from the ridges, and the knights, weighed down in their heavy mail, struggled to fight in the rocky passes. Some fell from hunger and exhaustion, their bodies left in the dust, eyes glassy beneath the burning sun. At Dorylaeum in 1097, the Crusaders fought a desperate battle against the Seljuks, who nearly shattered their columns with cavalry and arrows that fell like hail. The Crusaders prayed to their God as they bled, their lips cracked from thirst, their wounds festering beneath chainmail. And when the tide turned in their favor, they showed no mercy to the wounded Turks who lay before them. Their passage was a moving plague, a crawling hunger that chewed through the villages and towns along their path. They stripped the countryside of grain, slaughtered livestock, emptied wells, and sometimes turned on the very Christians who lived in those lands, if they could not give enough to fill the Crusaders' endless need. They were holy warriors, but their bellies ached with the same hunger as any thief's, and the fire in their faith did not feed their bodies. As they pushed into Syria, their numbers had thinned, but the iron in their will had hardened. Disease swept through their camps. Dysentery turned the ground around them foul, and the moans of the sick became part of the nightly prayers. Horses died, and knights once proud were forced to walk beside their squires, dragging broken boots through sand and rock. Armor was pawned for bread. Swords were traded for stale grain, and the promise of Jerusalem seemed as distant as ever. They fought among themselves, quarrels erupting between lords over scraps of land, over stolen treasure, over the bodies of prisoners. They bickered over who would rule the lands they had yet to conquer. Even as the reality of conquest slipped from their dirty, trembling hands. As they neared Antioch, the gateway to Syria, they found a city well defended, rich, and essential for any hope of reaching Jerusalem. They laid siege in October 1097, but the siege turned on them. The defenders inside the walls had supplies, while the Crusaders outside had only the hope that God would feed them. Winter came, and the snow fell on the tents of men who had marched from warm homes far away, and their prayers grew bitter. They ate anything they could find: grass, roots, leaves from trees, boiled leather scraped from saddles, the bones of dead animals cracked open from marrow. They dug up the bodies of their own dead to strip them of clothes for warmth. And in the shadows, some whispered of darker meals, rumors that some had begun to eat the flesh of the dead. Every day, men deserted, slipping away into the darkness, hoping to find mercy among the enemy rather than death among their own. But the Turks captured many of them, executing them before the walls, their heads displayed on spikes as a warning to those who still dreamed of escape. Inside Antioch, the people starved too, as the siege dragged on. But the Crusaders were too desperate to care. They saw visions of saints, they claimed, who promised victory if they endured, who promised the gates of heaven if they died with swords in hand. And so they clung to hope, like drowning men clinging to driftwood. In June 1098, they finally took Antioch, using treachery to open the gates, flooding in with the fury of the starved, hacking down defenders in the streets, looting what little was left. But their victory was hollow, for almost immediately they found themselves under siege by a Turkish relief army. The roles reversed, and their hunger only grew. Pestilence swept the city, piles of bodies rotting in the heat, the air thick with the smell of blood and decay. Flies swarmed the dead, and men could hardly pray without gagging on the stench. Crusader knights, once resplendent in polished steel, now wore rags stained with sweat and filth, their skin crawling with lice, their faces hollow from starvation. When the Turkish forces were finally defeated and the siege lifted, the Crusaders staggered out of Antioch with fewer numbers, many of them too weak to hold a sword, but driven by the promise that Jerusalem was now within reach. They moved through Syria, their numbers thinned, their faith now mixed with desperation and madness. The local populations watched them pass with fear. For these were men who would take anything to stay alive: food, water, dignity, and who would kill without hesitation if denied. And so they came to Marat al-Numand in December 1098, a city in northern Syria, rich enough to feed them, fortified enough to resist them. For a time, the siege was brutal. The Crusaders surrounded the city, cutting off supplies, battering its walls with stones and fire, waiting for hunger to do what their swords could not. The people inside, terrified, held out as long as they could, but hunger broke them, just as it had broken the Crusaders many times before. When the walls fell, the Crusaders surged in, swords raised, voices hoarse with screams that had once been prayers. They butchered the defenders, cut down the civilians, took what they could carry, and left the streets slick with blood that ran into the dust outside the gates. But this time, even looting could not feed them. There was not enough food to satisfy the hunger that gnawed at them like rats in the night. They had come too far, lost too much, and the winter was cold. The roads ahead uncertain. It was here, in Maora, that desperation turned to horror. For when there was nothing left to eat, when the last scraps were gone, when even the bones of animals had been cracked open and sucked dry, the Crusaders began to look at the bodies that littered the streets, at the corpses of those they had slain, and they made a choice that would haunt history forever. They chose flesh. Not the flesh of animals, but the flesh of men, of women, of children, those they had killed, and those who had simply died from starvation or wounds, left to rot in the cold dust of a ruined city. Chroniclers would later record, in words etched with horror, that the Crusaders boiled human flesh, roasted the bodies of the dead, and consumed them to stay alive. Some tried to deny it, to bury the shame beneath the holy cause they carried. But others, like Rodolphe of Caen, admitted that it happened, that the holy warriors became cannibals in Ma'ara. And as they tore flesh from bone, as they fed the children of God with the flesh of his creations, they believed that somehow their sins would be forgiven, that the cross they wore still made them righteous. For this was a holy war, they said, and in the name of holiness, they would do anything to survive. It was the word that had burned in the minds of the Crusaders since they first stepped out of their villages and castles in Europe, clutching rusty swords and wooden crosses, praying for salvation and forgiveness. It was the promise of eternal glory, the city of God, the place where Christ had walked, where he had died, and where, they believed, their souls would find redemption if they could reclaim it for Christianity. And so they crawled across continents, leaving trails of blood, ash, and bones, driven by faith, greed, and desperation. By the time they reached the dusty hills surrounding Jerusalem in June 1099, they were not the same men who had left Europe years before. Their numbers had dwindled, their bodies were covered in scars, lice, and dirt, and their faith had become something darker, steeled by starvation, brutality, and the belief that the cleansing of their sins was worth any crime committed along the way. The city itself stood defiant on its hills, its walls solid and high, its gates shut against the coming tide. Inside, Muslim Jews and Eastern Christians prepared for the siege, stockpiling food, reinforcing walls, and praying that the foreigners outside would vanish back into the deserts from which they came. The Crusaders surrounded the city, setting up their ragged camps under the hot, merciless sun. They were exhausted, many half-starved, their horses gone, their armor patched with rope and leather strips, their weapons rusted from sweat and blood. They had seen so many die along the way that death itself felt like an old companion. But Jerusalem was there, before them, the city they had bled for, the city they had killed for. And they would not turn back now. They began the siege in early June 1099, cutting off the city's water supplies and blocking roads and building wooden siege towers with timber taken from dismantled ships dragged overland from the coast. It was a desperate gamble. There was little food left. Disease was spreading in the camps, and the summer heat was turning the ground to dust. Inside Jerusalem, the defenders watched from the walls as the Crusaders built their machines of war, preparing for the coming storm. The city was defended by Fatimid troops and local militias, determined to protect their homes from the invaders outside. They reinforced the gates, prepared boiling oil, and sharpened swords, knowing that if the Crusaders broke through, there would be no mercy. The days dragged on. Skirmishes erupted near the walls, arrows flew back and forth, and Crusaders fell to the ground, screaming as they were carried away to die in the heat and filth of the siege camps. Water became precious, and many Crusaders drank from dirty wells, their lips cracked, their bellies twisting with sickness. At night, prayers echoed through the camps, chants to God to give them victory, to give them the strength to finish what they had started. Some claimed visions, seeing saints and angels promising that Jerusalem would be theirs if they had faith. Others simply clutched their weapons, staring at the city walls, thinking of the families they had left behind, of the sins they had committed, and of the salvation they believed was waiting for them inside those walls. On July 13, 1099, the final assault began. The Crusaders pushed their siege towers forward, the ground shaking as the massive wooden structures rolled toward the walls. Arrows rained down from the defenders, stones were hurled, and pots of boiling oil shattered on the Crusaders below, setting men on fire as they screamed in agony. But the Crusaders pushed forward, driven by desperation and the promise that Jerusalem would wipe away every sin they had carried since leaving home. They shouted prayers as they climbed the towers, as ladders were thrown against the walls, as swords clashed against shields. On July 15, the Crusaders broke through. A group led by Godfrey of Bouillon managed to get a siege tower close enough to the walls, near the northeast corner, allowing the Crusaders to climb over. Another breach was made at St. Stephen's Gate, and soon the gates were thrown open, and the Crusaders poured into Jerusalem. What followed was not a victory, but a massacre. The Crusaders, fueled by years of hunger, fear, and bloodlust, surged through the streets with swords and axes, cutting down anyone in their path. Muslims who fled to the Al-Aqsa Mosque seeking sanctuary were slaughtered in the courtyards, their blood pooling on the marble floors. Chroniclers described the Crusaders riding through the streets with blood up to their knees. Jews who sought refuge in their synagogues found no sanctuary. The Crusaders set the buildings on fire, burning the people alive inside, the screams rising into the air as the flames consumed them. Those who tried to escape were cut down in the streets. Men, women, children. It did not matter. The Crusaders saw them as enemies of God. And in the chaos of the city, the cries for mercy were drowned out by the clash of steel and the shouts of men praising God as they killed. The Temple Mount, one of the holiest sites in the city, became a killing ground. Crusaders hacked down those who fled there, turning the sacred ground into a field of corpses. Some Crusaders, exhausted from the killing, paused only to loot the bodies before moving on to find more to slay. Raymond of Aguilas, a Crusader chronicler, wrote that, in the Temple of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins, describing the scene with a mix of horror and religious triumph. For the Crusaders, this was not a crime. It was a victory ordained by God, a cleansing of the holy city from unbelievers. For 2 days, the slaughter continued. The Crusaders looted homes, stole gold and valuables, and dragged people into the streets to be executed. The smell of blood and smoke filled the city, mixing with the summer heat to create a stench that would linger in the memories of those who survived. They prayed as they killed. They sang hymns as they set fires. They thanked God for their victory as they hacked down the terrified, the helpless, the begging. And when it was over, Jerusalem was theirs. The streets were littered with corpses, the gutters ran red with blood, and the air was thick with the buzzing of flies. The Crusaders, who had once wept for bread and water, now feasted on the spoils of the dead, walking through the city like conquerors, proclaiming that God had delivered Jerusalem into their hands. They held victory masses in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, their blood-stained hands raised in prayer, thanking God for the holy victory that had come at the cost of so many lives. But the truth was clear, even in their prayers. The siege of Jerusalem was not just a victory for the Crusaders. It was a massacre, a moment when faith and violence merged into something monstrous, a moment when men who claimed to serve God became executioners in his name. And as they stood in the holy city, surrounded by the dead, the Crusaders believed they had earned their salvation. But history would remember what they had done. When the screams had faded and the blood had dried on the stones of Jerusalem, the Crusaders finally stood in the city they had crossed a continent to reach. They knelt on the blood-slick floors of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, their prayers rising into the heavy, copper-scented air, thanking God for granting them victory. But the price they paid, and the price they forced others to pay, would ripple far beyond those sun-bleached walls. The Crusaders saw themselves as holy warriors, cleansed of sin by the sword, sanctified by slaughter. They believed they had done God's will, purging the Holy Land of infidels, so that Christians might once again walk freely in the city of Christ. Chroniclers like Raymond of Aguilar's and Fulcher of Chartres recorded the events as victories, even divine miracles, praising God as they described the rivers of blood that had washed through the streets. But not everyone saw the glory they claimed. Even in medieval Christian Europe, some voices whispered that what had happened in Jerusalem, and before that at Ma'ara, was too much, too dark to be justified, even in the name of faith. Some clergy quietly questioned whether the Crusaders had gone too far, whether the burning of synagogues, filled with screaming families, the slaughter of children in the streets, and the brutal massacres of entire cities were truly God's will, or whether men had simply cloaked their greed and bloodlust in the language of salvation. There were knights who returned to Europe haunted by what they had seen and done, carrying with them stories of horrors they would share in hushed tones by the fire. They spoke of the screams that echoed in the stone alleys of Jerusalem, of the smell of burning flesh in Ma'ara, of the emptiness that came after the blood had been spilled and the holy victory had turned to silence. Yet, for many, the glory outweighed the guilt. Songs were sung in Europe of the brave Crusaders who had reclaimed Jerusalem, of the men who had fought under the cross, their sins washed away by the blood they had spilled. Kings and nobles took pride in the stories, using them to inspire more crusades, more wars, more waves of men who would march toward the east with dreams of salvation and glory. For the Muslim world, however, the memory was different. The Crusaders were not holy warriors. They were invaders, butchers who came with swords in one hand and crosses in the other, who claimed to serve God while tearing apart families, burning cities, and turning holy places into slaughterhouses. The sack of Jerusalem became a symbol of betrayal, a memory passed down through generations as a warning of what came when foreign armies arrived claiming divine purpose. Christian-Muslim relations would never be the same. The First Crusade opened wounds that would bleed for centuries, creating distrust and hatred that would fuel conflict long after the Crusaders who fought at Jerusalem had turned to dust. It hardened lines between East and West, between Islam and Christianity, transforming a complex, interconnected world into one fractured by religious war. The Muslim chroniclers wrote of the Crusaders with a mixture of horror and disgust, describing their brutality, their greed, and the way they violated the sanctity of life. Stories of the Crusaders, cannibalism, at Ma'ara spread, darkening the image of these so-called holy warriors into something monstrous. Even the word franje in Arabic would come to carry the weight of fear, representing men who killed without mercy and claimed it was God's will. And yet, the Crusades did not end with Jerusalem. The capture of the holy city was only the beginning of centuries of back and forth wars, of sieges, betrayals, massacres, and moments of fragile peace shattered by greed and zealotry. Future crusades would be launched, each claiming the same holy purpose, each promising to reclaim or defend Jerusalem, and each leaving behind more blood, more ashes, more dead who would never see the paradise promised by those who led them into war. In Europe, the Crusades shaped culture and identity, becoming legends used to inspire knights, to justify new wars, to collect money, and under the banner of the cross. Yet as centuries passed, the image of the Crusader shifted. The romantic tales of chivalry and holy war slowly unraveled, revealing the darker truth beneath the banners and prayers. Today, most modern Christians do not see themselves in the Crusaders who butchered civilians in the name of God. Few would claim the massacres of Jerusalem or the cannibalism at Ma'ara as acts of faith to be celebrated. The Crusades have become a symbol of religious fanaticism, a reminder of how easily faith can be twisted into a weapon, how the promise of salvation can be used to justify the darkest of deeds. In the streets of Jerusalem, the stones that once ran with blood still stand, silent witnesses to the screams that once echoed there. The mosques, the churches, and the synagogues that stood during that siege have been rebuilt, repaired, but the memory remains. The Crusaders believed they were the instruments of God's will, that every life they took was a step closer to their own salvation, that the horrors they committed were sanctified by faith. But history sees them as men who lost themselves in the darkness, who allowed their faith to become a blade that cut through the innocent, the helpless, the desperate. And in that reflection, there is a lesson: religious fanaticism, no matter how righteous it claims to be, can turn into horror when men forget their own humanity in pursuit of a promise they believe is worth more than the lives of others. The Crusades remind us that history is dark, that faith without mercy becomes cruelty, and that even those who claim to fight for the light can leave only darkness in their wake. And as we look back on the Crusaders, their crosses covered in dust and blood, we see not just the story of a war for a city, but the story of what happens when men believe that any crime can be justified if committed in the name of a higher power. They marched to Jerusalem seeking salvation, but they left behind a legacy of brutality, and history will never forget. They came with faith. They left their homes and families, kissed their children goodbye, and marched under banners of the cross, believing that God Himself walked beside them. They believed they were chosen, that they were warriors of light crossing the world to reclaim the holiest city on earth, that every mile they walked was a mile closer to salvation. They prayed as they marched. They prayed as they starved. They prayed as they killed. But faith alone does not feed the hungry, and salvation alone does not shield the weak from the darkness within themselves. On the road to Jerusalem, their faith became desperation, their hunger became madness, and the promise of paradise became soaked in the blood of the innocent. They burned villages for bread. They slaughtered entire cities in the name of a god they claimed to serve. And when the cold winds of Ma'ara cut through their rag tents, and when their bellies ached with starvation, they crossed a line that even they could barely comprehend. They tore the flesh from the dead, boiled the bodies of those they had killed, and ate the remains, believing that God would forgive them, because they were doing His will. And when they finally reached Jerusalem, when the walls fell and the city lay open before them, they did not find the peace they claimed to seek. They found slaughter. They killed without mercy, the streets running red with the blood of Muslims, Jews, and Christians alike. They rode through the holy city with blood up to their knees, proclaiming God's victory as the screams of the dying echoed in the narrow streets. They came seeking salvation, but they left behind fire, ash, and bones. Power and belief are dangerous companions. Together, they can turn good men into monsters. Together, they can transform faith into fanaticism, devotion into destruction, and hope into horror. The Crusaders believed they were saving their souls. Instead, they became part of a legacy of brutality that would echo through history, a story of how easily humans can justify the darkest acts when they believe they carry the approval of a higher power. History is not a clean story of heroes and villains, of light triumphing over darkness. It is often darkness itself. It is filled with men and women who believed they were righteous as they committed unspeakable acts, who believed they were chosen as they slaughtered the innocent, who believed they were holy as they tore the world apart. And that is why we must remember it, because the darkness of history is not just a story of the past. It is a warning for the present and for the future, a reminder that faith without humility, power without restraint, and belief without compassion can lead even the most righteous cause into a nightmare of blood and fire. The Crusaders came seeking God. They left behind ghosts. And that is why we tell these stories. Because history is dark, and we must remember it.